They called them the Horsemen of Hell, riders who came with no warning and left behind only silence. The Mongols, for centuries, their name alone made kings tremble and empires vanish. They moved like a storm over the earth, a living tempest of hooves, arrows, and smoke. From the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the palaces of Persia, from the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary, their thunderous charge reshaped the map of the world. Cities that once stood proud became dust beneath their hooves. Whole nations bowed without a fight, terrified by the stories that spread ahead of them, stories of fire that never died, of blades that never missed, and of generals who seemed to command the wind itself. They were not an army, they were a force of nature. To face them was not war, it was doom. The Mongol Empire, forged by the will of Genghis Khan, became the largest continuous land empire in human history. It stretched like a shadow across continents, swallowing civilizations that had stood for centuries. No kingdom was too strong, no wall too high. China's mighty dynasties fell, Persia's glittering cities burned, the Islamic caliphates were reduced to whispers. Even the heart of Europe, that distant, divided land of knights and cathedrals, began to shake at the echo of hooves that came from the east. Monks wrote of them as punishment sent by God. Peasants called them demons with human faces. They were the embodiment of speed, precision, and terror. Their tactics were unlike anything Europe had ever seen. They fought without fear, using deception as easily as they used the bow. A Mongol army could vanish into the plains, only to reappear days later behind enemy lines. They carried no heavy armor, no siege machines, yet they toppled fortresses built over generations. To those who survived their wrath, it seemed as if the laws of war had been rewritten, and for a time, it was true. The Mongols had changed everything. But what happens when an unstoppable force meets a world that learns from its pain? Because in the ashes of defeat, Europe began to study its destroyer. It was a long, bitter lesson, written in blood and ruin, but it would change the course of history. When the Mongols first reached the edges of Europe, their arrival was like the end of days. In 1241, at the Battle of Liegnitz, they crushed a combined army of Poles and Germans in hours. The same year, Hungary was overrun, its villages burned, its rivers choked with corpses. Panic spread westward, faster than their horses could ride, and then, just as suddenly as they had come, they vanished. Europe called it a miracle, but the Mongols had not been defeated. They had only withdrawn, summoned east by the death of their great Khan, Ogaday. Still, that brief retreat was enough to give Europe a sliver of time, and time, history shows, is all civilizations ever need to turn prey into predator. Because the Mongols had taught Europe more than fear, they had taught it to evolve. Over the next century, those trembling kingdoms that once prayed for mercy began to sharpen their swords in silence. They learned from their enemy, their mobility, their strategy, their ruthlessness, and while the Mongols grew weaker, divided by distance and greed, Europe began to rise with something new: technology, organization, and the birth of gunpowder warfare. The same world that once called them the scourge of God was now preparing to become their undoing. Empires rise on conquest, but they fall to adaptation, and what Europe learned from the Mongols would not only destroy them, it would shape the next 600 years of global domination. This is the story of how the invincible horsemen of the East met their match, not on the open plains of Asia, but in the heart of Europe, a place they thought too divided to ever resist them. Yet it was from that division that a new kind of power was born, one that would outlast the empire of Genghis Khan himself. If you love uncovering how forgotten empires rose and fell, subscribe before this story vanishes again. They were not merely soldiers, they were a machine built for domination. The Mongol army, forged under Genghis Khan and perfected by his sons and grandsons, was a weapon unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. It moved with terrifying speed, striking hundreds of miles apart, yet coordinated to the hour. Each division of horsemen carried its own supplies, weapons, and orders sealed in leather pouches, instructions delivered through a vast relay network that stretched from the heart of Mongolia to the edges of Europe. Messengers rode day and night, switching horses at every post, relaying intelligence faster than any European kingdom could even send word to its nearest allies. This was the Mongol secret: mobility as strategy, precision as religion. Their horses were their lifeblood. Each warrior rode with several, changing mounts mid-battle to never tire. They could ride for days, sleep in the saddle, and strike before dawn without warning. To face them was to face the embodiment of speed and discipline, a kind of warfare that made Europe's armored knights look like lumbering relics of a slower age. The Mongols didn't fight by the rules Europe understood. They used deception as easily as they used steel. A retreat was never a retreat. It was a trap. They would feign flight, drawing their enemies into open plains, then turn and encircle them with deadly precision. Their arrows fell like rain and their banners, black, crimson and gold, became symbols of impending death. When the Mongols attacked, they did not just seek victory, they sought annihilation. Entire populations were slaughtered as warnings to others. Their philosophy was clear: conquer through terror so no one dares resist again. And it worked. In a single generation, they had crushed the Jin dynasty in China, the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, and swept through the Abbasid Caliphate like fire through dry grass. But their invasion of Europe, that would become the stuff of nightmare. In 1241, under Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, the Mongols poured into Eastern Europe with unstoppable force. At the Battle of Liegnitz, a coalition of Polish, German and Teutonic knights fell within hours. Witnesses said the sky turned black with arrows, that the very earth shook beneath the hooves of tens of thousands of horses. The banners of Christian knights, once symbols of divine protection, lay trampled in blood and ash. Days later, the Mongols turned south toward Hungary. The fortified city of Pest fell, villages vanished overnight, entire regions were left barren, their churches burned, their rivers filled with the dead. To those who survived, it seemed that the world was ending. Priests declared that the apocalypse had arrived, that these riders were the punishment of God. Some claimed they were demons, not men. Others whispered that no weapon could harm them, that they were spirits bound to vengeance. In less than a year, Central Europe lay open before them. Vienna, Bohemia, even the German heartland seemed next. But then silence. The storm stopped. As suddenly as they had appeared, the Mongols began to withdraw. Europe called it a miracle, a divine act of mercy. But in truth, it was not God. It was death. The great Khan, Ogedei, had died in faraway Karakoram, and Mongol law demanded every prince return home to elect a new leader. Batu Khan, though eager for conquest, obeyed the ancient code. The horsemen turned east, leaving behind a continent that had seen hell and survived. Europe's scars ran deep, but those scars would become lessons. While the Mongols fractured into rival hordes and internal wars, Europe rebuilt, wiser, harder, and more united than before. The knights who once charged recklessly began to adapt. They forged stronger armor, weapons that could pierce through Mongol speed. The crossbow, once dismissed as a peasant's tool, became a weapon of equalizer, able to strike a mounted warrior from afar. But the greatest revolution came not from muscle, but from invention. Gunpowder, the very element that the Mongols had helped spread through their trade routes, would now be used to end their dominance. Cannons appeared on European walls, loud and terrifying, shaking the battlefield in ways that even Mongol horses feared. And as kingdoms that once despised each other, Christian and pagan, Catholic and Orthodox, began to form fragile alliances, a new kind of resistance emerged. Europe was no longer fighting for survival, it was preparing for transformation. The Mongols had taught them the art of speed, the value of strategy, and the cruelty of total war. Now Europe would teach them something else: how innovation defeats fear. How do you destroy an enemy who moves faster than fear itself? You change the rules of war. The empire that once seemed eternal began to crack from within. What the swords of 1,000 enemies could not do, time and pride began to accomplish. The Mongol Empire, once united under the iron will of Genghis Khan, had grown too vast, too powerful, too divided to hold. Its lifeblood, speed, obedience and fear, began to thin. After the death of Genghis, his descendants turned the empire into a family feud, each khanate pulling in its own direction: the Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Once they moved as one, now they moved against each other. Civil wars erupted over succession, trade and tribute. Brothers betrayed brothers, generals turned into kings of their own broken lands. The unity that had once made them unstoppable now became their greatest weakness. The empire that had conquered through fear began to fear itself. Then nature dealt the cruelest blow of all. The same vast trade networks that had carried silk, silver, and spices across continents, the veins of the Mongol world, carried death instead. From the steppes to the shores of the Mediterranean, the Black Death traveled along Mongol caravans, and merchant ships. It is said that in 1346, during the siege of the Genoese city of Kaffa, in Crimea, Mongol forces catapulted the corpses of plague victims over the walls, a desperate act of war that unleashed one of the deadliest pandemics in history. Within a few years, entire Mongol garrisons lay in ruin. The very roads that once united east and west became highways of corpses. Trade collapsed, armies dwindled, and trust vanished. The Pax Mongolica, the peace of the Mongols, turned into a whisper of ghosts. Meanwhile, in the west, the world was changing faster than the Mongols could adapt. Europe, once crippled by fear, had begun to evolve. The survivors of the plague learned resilience. Those who lived built stronger societies, richer cities, and deadlier armies. The knights of old were gone, replaced by soldiers trained in tactics, borrowed from the very enemy they once feared. Ironically, the Mongols had taught their enemies how to defeat them. The crossbow had already proved its worth, but now came a new and terrible sound: gunfire. The spread of gunpowder from China through the Silk Road, once a symbol of Mongol prosperity, became the weapon that would destroy. Walls that once fell to Mongol siege engines now roared back with cannons. Cavalry charges that once shattered knights now met with thunder and smoke. But Europe's revenge would not come from the west. It would rise from the ashes of subjugation in the east. In the forests of Russia, the people who had suffered under the yoke of the Golden Horde began to turn their pain into purpose. Moscow, once a tribute-paying vassal, learned from the Mongols every strength, their taxation system, their centralized rule, their methods of control. For over a century, the Russians had been students of their conquerors, biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. By the late 14th century, that moment had come. The Mongols, now fractured and weakened by internal conflict, faced a new kind of resistance, one organized, disciplined, and armed with the tools of a new age. No longer could they rely on fear to paralyze their enemies. No longer could they move faster than their foe. Gunpowder weapons, fortified stone cities, and growing European alliances turned the old battlefield into something the steppe warriors could not master. The Golden Horde, once the terror of Christendom, was now bleeding from within, its lords fighting for power, its armies reduced, its aura of invincibility shattered. Then came Kulikovo, 1380, the battle that would echo across centuries. On the wide plains near the Don River, two worlds met: the fading empire of the Mongols and the rising power of Russia. Prince Dmitry of Moscow, known as Dmitry Donskoy, led a coalition of Russian principalities under a single banner. Facing them was the army of Mamai, a powerful Mongol warlord of the Golden Horde. For the first time, the Russians stood united, not as slaves, not as tribute-bearers, but as a people determined to end their humiliation. The air was thick with rain and fear. The Mongols, though fewer than in their golden days, still fought with the deadly precision of the steppes. But this time, something was different. The Russians had studied their enemy, matched their speed, countered their fate, and when the hidden regiment of Donskoy's men, concealed in a forest flank, charged into the Mongol rear, the tide turned. What followed was chaos. For the first time in centuries, Mongol horsemen broke ranks and fled. The thunder of hooves, once the sound of conquest, became the sound of retreat. Kulikovo was not just a battle, it was a prophecy. It marked the beginning of the end. From that day, the power of the Golden Horde would never be the same. The legend of Mongol invincibility was shattered, and in its place rose the dawn of a new power, Russia. For the first time in centuries, the horsemen of the steppe were running, not conquering. Their empire, once a storm that swallowed the world, had become a fading echo across the plain. If you were a Mongol commander watching your empire crumble, what would you have done differently? Comment your answer below. History has a cruel sense of symmetry. It always circles back to the same truth. Power is never permanent. The Mongols once believed they were destined to rule the world, chosen by the heavens to bring order through conquest. For generations, that belief seemed unshakable. They were unstoppable, untouchable, and unrivaled. But what they did not see was that every empire, no matter how mighty, plants the seeds of its own downfall the moment it stops changing. The Mongols mastered the art of war, mobility, fear, precision, but they failed to master time. When the world evolved, they stood still, trusting in the same strategies that had once made them gods. And so, what no sword could do, time and innovation accomplished with quiet patience. Their fall was not just the end of an empire, it was the beginning of a new age. Europe, once shattered and terrified, rebuilt itself in the image of its conquerors. The Mongols had shown them what total war looked like, how to think beyond borders, how to strike with speed and organization, how to use fear as a weapon. But Europe took those lessons and transformed them. They added invention to brutality, science to ambition. They forged cannons instead of bows, ships instead of horses, and with those tools they began to reach beyond their own continent. The world that the Mongols had once connected through conquest would now be claimed through exploration and colonization. The irony could not be sharper. The conquerors had taught their victims how to surpass them. What makes the Mongol story eternal is not its scale of destruction, but its pattern of transformation. Power always shifts. It never stays in one hand forever. The Mongols humbled the Islamic caliphates, crushed China's dynasties, and nearly erased Europe's courage. Yet centuries later, it was Europe that would rise to dominate the globe. Empires rise, not because they are righteous, but because they are adaptable. They fall not because they are weak, but because they forget how to change. The Mongols believed speed and fear could conquer all, but the world learned to fight differently, with ideas, technology, and persistence. Their strength became outdated the moment innovation replaced terror. And yet, the Mongols left behind something no other empire had achieved. They made the world smaller. They created a single web of trade, culture, and communication that stretched from the Pacific to the Atlantic. In doing so, they proved that humanity is connected, in progress, and in ruin. The same roads that carried their armies later carried knowledge, medicine, and invention. Even their downfall became a kind of gift, a reminder that the world moves forward only when power breaks, and something new emerges from the ruin. So when we look back at the Mongols, their unmatched victories, their sudden collapse, what we see is not just a story of conquest, but of evolution. Every empire thinks it will last forever. Every generation believes it has mastered control, but time never kneels. The same wind that carried Mongol arrows across continents now whispers the same warning to all who rise too high. Nothing is invincible, not armies, not empires, not even ideas. Power never lasts. Only lessons do. The fall of the Horsemen was not the end of chaos. It was the beginning of transformation. As Europe rose from the ashes, it built a new kind of warfare, one fueled not by courage or code, but by cold invention. Gunpowder replaced honor, walls crumbled before cannon, and the knight, once the symbol of chivalry and pride, became a relic of a dying age. In our next story we uncover how the rise of gunpowder shattered medieval ideals, rewrote the rules of power, and gave birth to the brutal, modern world. The age of chivalry burned out in smoke, and from its ashes, Europe forged an empire of fire and iron. If you leave without subscribing, this truth disappears, buried again beneath the ashes of history.